The first thing Caldero learned about Reed Calloway was that he had come into town with a string of horses he was selling and nothing else to recommend him, and that within the week he had knocked Bud Fenner flat on the saloon floor without a word about why. Nobody saw what Bud had done to earn it. That was the particular trouble with Reed Calloway. The thing that mattered most always happened before the watching started, and by the time anyone was looking, the picture had already been drawn wrong. He had taken the place north of town the following year. 800 acres of decent grazing land, a house in need of repair, a creek that ran cold and clear most of the year. He fixed it himself alongside a hired hand named Orville who talked enough for 4 men and kept the silence from becoming a problem and made no effort to correct the county's opinion of him. The county did what counties do with quiet men who don't explain themselves. They filled in the parts they couldn't see. The version that settled on Reed Calloway was that he had been run out of 2 territories before landing in Caldero, that a man who kept that hard to himself had reasons worth keeping private. Women at the dry goods counter said it with authority. Men at the feed store said less, but watched him when he came in for supplies. He came to town twice a month for what he needed and went back to his land, and Caldero watched him go and polished the story it preferred. The September Thursday the southbound stage came in was ordinary in every respect until it wasn't. Reed had driven in for a crate of hardware and 2 lengths of chain for the south gate. He had the crate half loaded when the stage pulled up to the station 20 feet down the street. He stayed where he was. The job was half done, and he had never been a man to leave things in the middle. So he saw all of it. The woman who stepped down with a trunk and a traveling case, dressed carefully for an arrival. The scan of the platform. The moment her face made a small internal adjustment when the man she was looking for was not there. Warren Bowles arrived 4 minutes later on horseback, cattle money, and a loud opinion on most things. He looked at the woman. She looked back. Then he said, loud enough for the dozen people who had gathered for the stage, that there must have been some mistake. That the letters and what had arrived were 2 different things. His daughter stood near the water trough with 2 friends and smiled at the precise moment in his speech that made the most of it. The woman waited for him to finish. When he did, she asked him, in a carrying voice that required no effort, where she might find a room for the night. Bowles turned his horse and rode back down the street without answering. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Reed had set the last of the chain in the wagon bed. He stood a moment watching the platform clear. The people who had gathered found somewhere else to be. The woman stood with her trunk and her case in the flat gray light of the September afternoon, and the question she had asked was still in the air with no answer under it. He walked over. She was close to 30. Brown eyes, brown hair, a face that had been doing the work of not showing its feelings for long enough that it had gotten capable at it. She looked at him with the appraisal of a woman waiting to decide whether to be afraid, and finding, with some surprise, that it wasn't coming out that way. He picked up the trunk before he spoke. She let him. There was a hotel on the south end, he told her. Clean enough. He could carry this as far as the door. She picked up the traveling case herself and walked alongside him. At the hotel entrance, she thanked him in a tone that carried genuine weight. He set the trunk down, touched the brim of his hat, and went back to his wagon. Her name came to him through 2 conversations he was not part of, standing near enough to hear. Clara Voss, from a county in Indiana. Letters exchanged over 8 months with Warren Bowles. The fare west was not refundable. He thought about it on the drive home. A woman who had asked where to find a room in the same flat voice she probably used for every practical problem she had ever solved, and then gone and solved it. He told himself he wasn't thinking about anything in particular, went to bed, and woke up at 4 the next morning mostly decided. He went back on Friday. The practical circumstances were real. Orville had been eating beans 3 nights in 7 and had mentioned it without being subtle. The ranch house had a spare room standing empty except for fence posts and a broken lantern. He needed a cook and had been putting off finding one. He told her the situation plainly. A room in the ranch house, board included, fair wages for 3 meals daily for 2 men, and no obligation past the spring roundup if she wanted to move on. He handed the terms to her without ornamentation and waited. She asked whether the room had a lock, whether she would be expected to account for her time to anyone outside the work itself. He said yes to the lock and no to the accounting. She said she would need until morning. He said he would be at the hardware store at 9. She was there at 5 past. The ranch house was spare in the way of practical men who have lived alone long enough that want and need have become the same category. Functional, clean, nothing that didn't serve a purpose, and several purposes that had gone unserved because no one had been there to notice them. A shelf in the kitchen that could have held things and held nothing. A window over the eastern pasture with a curtain rod and no curtain. A table built for 4 that had never seated more than 2. Clara moved through the rooms without remarking on any of it. She asked one question about where. The wood was stacked and went to work. The first supper she made was salt pork, cornbread, and beans cooked with something in them that made them taste like a meal instead of a duty. Orville finished his plate and started on the cornbread without speaking, which for Orville meant the food had exceeded expectation considerably. Reed ate, set his fork down, and said it was good. She said she was glad. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. The days found a shape. Coffee going before the roosters, breakfast on the table by the time the horses were seen to. He learned her in the margins of the working day. The way her hands stayed in motion even when the rest of her was still. The evenings she spent mending at the kitchen table by lamplight, working through the household's collection of things that had torn and been left that way. The flat, clear-eyed quality of her attention when something went wrong. Not alarm, just the steady reckoning of a person who had been solving her own problems for long enough that the solving had become how she moved through the world. He found himself one morning fixing the back porch step that had been listing left for 2 months. He did it specifically because she crossed the back porch 6 times a day for firewood, and he had seen her check the step each time, the slight shift in her footing that said she had made a note of it. He did not mention having done it. He did not need to. She noticed everything. She simply did not remark on it. He brought in extra wood on 3 consecutive evenings before the cold settled in. On the 3rd evening, she met him at the door to take the second armload and stacked it herself along the kitchen wall and said thank you in the tone she used for practical things, which were all her tones. But in this one, there was something underneath the practicality that he chose not to examine too directly. She saw the other thing the town hadn't seen one Tuesday evening when he came in from the pasture and stopped at the barn to check on the gray mare, who had been favoring her left foreleg since Monday. He crouched beside her and ran his hand along the leg with the full weight of his focus given over to something that couldn't tell him where the hurt was. He spoke to her in a low voice. No particular words Clara could catch from the kitchen window, just the tone of a person saying there was time, that it could take as long as it needed, that he was not going anywhere. She watched for 10 minutes before she went back to the stove. There was a version of Reed Calloway Caldero had been using, and there was what she had seen, and she was not a woman who confused the two. He had fixed the step before she asked. He had brought in wood 3 evenings running. In 2 months, she had not once had cause to use the lock on her room door. The stories the town told were about a man it had never stopped to watch for 10 minutes. The town's attention found her in the 2nd week. She drove in with Reed for the monthly supply run and felt it on the main street, the quality of watching that had nothing to do with the supplies. Mrs. Greer served her with a pleasant smile that carried something being measured behind it. 3 women on the dry goods porch stopped speaking freely when she passed, which meant they had been speaking about her. She understood the particular courtesy of people who considered your choices a problem you were about to discover. She had learned it in Indiana when she told people about the arrangement west. She kept her hands on her parcels and said nothing to anyone. Orville broke a finger in the 5th week. Not badly, but enough to generate a volume of complaint that far exceeded the injury. Clara sat and splinted it at the kitchen table while Reed held the lamp, and Orville talked throughout about his roping prospects. And she said he would lose them entirely if he didn't hold still, and Reed said nothing but the corner of his mouth moved. Orville caught it. He mentioned it that weekend to a pair of Devlin's hands he sometimes drank with, because Orville had never been built for discretion. Small things traveled fast in a cattle town in winter. By the time the first frost hit Caldero, most of it knew. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Devlin owned the largest spread in the county and had owned most of the county's opinion for most of a decade. He had offered Reed the foreman position 3 years back, less an offer than a test. What he needed was a man who would execute the quiet removal of a homesteading widow from a tract he wanted for its water access. Reed had listened to the full terms, set his coffee down, and walked out. That was the day Devlin started building a different version of Reed Calloway and putting it where it would do him the most good. When word of the arrangement at the North Ranch reached Devlin, he recognized a use for it. The first tool he reached for was Warren Bowles. Bowles had not been comfortable since September. Not guilty, which would have been more useful, just embarrassed in the thin way of a man who had been seen doing something small in public. Devlin told him, over whiskey on a Saturday evening, that he could still correct the mistake if he moved before things settled too firmly, that Clara Voss had proved herself steady and capable, and that Devlin himself could put in a good word with the Reverend if Bowles wanted to pursue a proper courtship. Bowles arrived at the Calloway Ranch on a Wednesday morning with late-season wildflowers and the rehearsed quality of someone who had been working on a speech. He dismounted at the post and started talking. He was halfway through it when she heard the barn door. Reed came out leading the gray mare. He stopped when he saw the horse at the post, looked at Bowles, looked at her, and stayed where he was, one hand on the lead rope, watching. She turned back to Bowles. She thanked him for coming. She said she had been told clearly at the station in September what his opinion was, and she had arranged her life around that information, and she had no intention of unarranging it. She said it in the same carrying voice she used for everything that mattered. Even and clear, no heat in it. The way she would say that a fence had been repaired and was not going back to needing it. Bowles looked past her toward the barn, replaced his hat, and went. She turned around. Reed was still watching Bowles ride out. He looked at her. She picked up the squash basket she had set down and went inside. Devlin's second tool was Reverend Harlow, a decent man who had occasionally been used by people who understood that a decent man with pastoral authority was a useful instrument. He came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon and sat at Clara's kitchen table and accepted coffee and explained that her situation was being discussed among those with her well-being in mind, that a woman alone in an arrangement with a man of uncertain reputation was risking more than she perhaps understood. He was kind about it. That was the harder thing. She listened until he finished. She said the room at the ranch had a lock she had never needed to use, that her time outside the cooking hours was her own, and she asked what specific improvement to propriety the Reverend had in mind. He had not prepared a specific answer for that question. She walked him to his horse. Reed found her standing in the yard after the dust of Harlow's departure settled. He looked at the road, then at her. He said the Reverend's name without inflection. She said yes. He asked if there had been any specific threat. She said no. It had been kindly done. He said she should not have to adjust her life on account of a conversation Devlin had started. She asked how long he had known it was Devlin. He said since Bowles arrived with flowers. She nodded. They walked back to the house together, and she made supper, and he ate it at the table, and neither of them spoke much, and neither of them found the silence empty. Devlin came himself on a Saturday, arriving when he thought Reed would be in the East Field. He was wrong. Reed was at the barn and came out to meet him. Devlin said Reed's land sat on the only decent water access in the North Quarter, that a man working 800 acres with one hand was lying to himself about the long run, and that a clean sale and a fresh start would benefit everyone involved. Reed let every word land. Then he said no. One word, flat and without heat, the way you close a door that has been open too long. Devlin said there were less pleasant ways for the conversation to go. Reed said he expected that was so, and that Devlin could find one if he needed to, and that he would be here. Then he went back into the barn. He came in from the south fence line a week later, late, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and there was a plate covered with a cloth at the edge of the stove the way she left things when he ran late. He stood looking at it a moment. Orville was in town. It was just the room and the warmth and the meal she had left him. He ate slowly and thought about what the house had looked like before September. The table that seated two and never had more. The silence he had not understood was loneliness until there was something to measure it against. He thought about March, the spring roundup and the arrangement reaching its end, and what the kitchen would look like that morning. He left the question alone that night. But it was there the next morning and the one after that, and it did not improve with leaving it alone. He found her on a Sunday afternoon cutting dried herbs in the kitchen garden, the last of the season before the hard frost finished them. The sky had gone the flat white of late November. He had come around the corner of the house with no particular purpose and stopped when he saw her, and then stayed. She straightened, looked at him, set the herb bunch on the garden wall. He said the arrangement had been made for practical reasons, and she had more than met those terms, and he wanted her to know she was under no obligation past what she herself wanted. She said she understood that. He said that was good, and then he said he would like her to stay. Not on those terms. On different ones. What came out was plain, without ornamentation. He said he had not been looking for anything when she stepped off that stage. That what had built itself over 2 months in the house and the yard and the kitchen was not something he had planned or expected. That she was the steadiest person he had ever known, and that he had stopped thinking about March with any kind of readiness and started thinking about it with something that felt like loss. He said, "I am asking you to marry me. Not on paper. I am asking because I want to, and I want you to have every opportunity to tell me no without it changing anything about your position here." The kitchen garden was very quiet. A horse shifted in the pen behind the barn. She thought about Indiana. The faces of the people she had told about the arrangement west. The platform in September and the flowers that had arrived Wednesday as the wrong answer to the wrong question. 2 months of mornings in this kitchen, a step repaired before she asked. A man in the dark of a barn with his hands on a hurt horse because it needed doing and there was no audience for it. She thought about a lock on a door she had never once needed to use. She reached out and took his hand, turned it over, looked at it. The calluses across the palm, the work written into every line of it, the steadiness of it even now. She looked up. Yes. The breath went out of him, long and slow. His hand closed around hers and held. The news traveled the way it always traveled in Caldero. 2 names on the deed for the North Ranch. That last detail moved fastest and landed differently, depending on who received it. At Devlin's breakfast table it sat there like something immovable. Bowles heard it at the saloon and said nothing. Mrs. Greer sent preserves to the ranch with her boy and no note. Clara set the jar on the shelf next to her tin of tea and left it there. They married on a Wednesday in December. Not a conventional day, but the day that worked, and neither of them had ever been especially concerned with convention. The church was cold enough that breath showed in the pews. Reed stood at the front and watched the door. When Clara came through it in a good wool dress, the only one she owned that she had been saving without quite knowing what for, he watched her walk the full length of the aisle. Not the door behind her, not the preacher. Her. His face did not perform anything. The man the town had invented and the man he actually was occupied the same face at the same time, and she saw it and did not slow her step. After, in the cold air outside, Mrs. Fenwick appeared with her practiced warmth and said how lovely, said what a change this must be, said it was good Clara would have a different life now. Clara looked at her steadily. She said she had been the same woman in Indiana that she was standing here, and she expected to remain so, and she hoped Mrs. Fenwick would come by for coffee sometime. Mrs. Fenwick's mouth opened and found no occupant. Reed offered his arm. She took it. They went to the wagon. In the spring, when the roundup came and went, nobody mentioned the original terms of the arrangement. Because the terms had been the scaffold and the scaffold had come down, and what was standing was the house and the kitchen and both names on the deed, and the gray mare moving through the east pasture without favoring anything. There was a chair at the table that had always been there and was used now. Small word for a large thing. Large things rarely arrive with the words they deserve. They come instead in the small details, a hat by the door, a covered plate at the edge of a stove, a step repaired, because someone you had not expected now crosses the porch 6 times a day, and you would like her not to have to check it every time. Reed Calloway had been the version of himself Caldero preferred. The hard man with the shut-away past, the one you kept at a distance. The real version had been doing things before anyone was watching, and none of those things had ever required an audience. Clara Voss had stepped off a stage in September with her trunk and her careful face, and the flat, quiet adjustment of a woman told publicly that she was insufficient. She had asked where to find a room, made her arrangements, worked and been steady, and asked for nothing she had not earned. What she had been given was a man who did not need her to be less to feel like more. A man who fixed the step before she asked, who left the plate covered at the edge of the stove, who sat in the dark of a barn with a hurt horse because that was simply who he was when no one was drawing the picture. The land went on ahead of them. The creek running cold and clear through the pasture. The smoke from the chimney going straight up into a March sky. She had learned not to expect things. She had learned it carefully and paid the cost of the learning for a long time. What she was learning now was how to let the learning go. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.